Marnin!
Madnin!
Welcome to the India Explained podcast, recorded in London and San Francisco. One take, unscripted, no rehearsal.
Hey Bunty, greetings from San Francisco. How are things at your end in London? Has that beast from the east thing gone away?
The Beast from the East has gone away. It is now actually very. We had a spot of rain, but this weekend has been dedicated to getting my car on the road. I had to do a bunch of things, get the brakes replaced, etc. It's prohibitive. Doing stuff in dealership, doing stuff in local dealership, all of those things that have been happening. Getting my mobility sorted has been the focus for this week. This weekend rather. And then the other thing that, obviously we've heard and picked up on in the news is the Oscars, which was some of the things, it was in news, and particularly today I was funny enough reading that Gary Oldman, the guy who won the Winston Churchill Darkest Hour Oscar, dedicated it to his mother and said that, I've got an Oscar, put the kettle on. Gary Oldman, so a lot of people told me that Gary Oldman was a great actor. I only recollect him as somebody who played a part in Batman, right? That's probably my cinematic ignorance. But I've seen him in this movie, and he's really good, and a very good depiction of Winston Churchill, which I think conveniently segues into what we want to talk about today, Rohit.
Right. So Shashi Tharoor wrote a piece in the Washington Post where he, took the Oscars to task for really lionizing Winston Churchill, and he pointed out that Churchill is, in effect, a criminal against humanity, and I don't think one can disagree with that. I would simply extend Shashi Tharoor's critique to, not just the Oscars and not just the Oscar award deciding committee, whatever it is, but really to a kind of, Western public imagination at large. The question here is that does Churchill benefit from what's called a victor's history? That from the perspective of people in many, many countries that were part of the British Empire, how is Churchill one whit better than Hitler?
That's a very good observation, Rohit. And I think, living in Britain, not a year goes by without some kind of homage, either in theatre or in movies or in musicals. The stereotype about Britain is that they are kind of very centered around the war. They somehow haven't got over 2 world wars and 1 World Cup. That's the way the nation's kind of imagination is built. 2 World Wars and 1 World Cup. And Winston Churchill is a central figure in history. He takes on kind of a Gandhi-like position in the nation's imagination, at least in the 20th century. And it's part of the way in which Britain learns about its history, is that this kind of inconvenient truth of colonialism is completely disregarded in history. So when I ask my daughter about her school, they're learning about the Tudors and kings from medieval times. And then they're kind of jumping to, the victory in the Second World War and the plan to reinvigorate Germany, the Marshall Plan, or reinvigorate Europe, right? So that whole colonial aspect is completely hidden from sight. So no wonder the British imagination about what Winston Churchill stood for is very wobbly.
Well, it's an excellent point you make. And, let's link this with what's happening in India. That in India, we've seen a lot of criticism, justifiably so, of a kind of amnesia about, political violence committed by Indians or Indian groups of the state against certain Indian groups in a post-47 context. These claims that the RSS keeps making. And I think just the other day, there was some RSS guy who was on NDTV saying that Taj Mahal is Hindu. Again, that same, old argument. These people are taken to task by political commentators, by historians and the like. Isn't the same thing happening, but just more slickly in Britain, right? How is British amnesia about Churchill any different from, the very ham-fisted, crude, laughable attempt to rewrite, but dangerous attempt to rewrite history by the RSS. And I guess the question I'm asking here is that, is there a sense in which the ugly nationalism of Britain and its corresponding historical amnesia is just made more palatable than, what we see in a quote-unquote third world or developing or even quote-unquote backward country, whether it's India or Kenya?
I think you've made a massively sophisticated point, and I don't think we'll kind of be able to unpick it in this particular conversation. But suffice to say that this kind of revisionist tendency that you have in history is not something isolated to either Britain or European nations. It was widespread in the communist regimes of the 20th century, where people would reinvent mythology, the role of the church, the role of the state, etc., to kind of line up against a narrative of party leadership. It's probably pretty much something that happens in China as we speak, which is one of the other kind of huge totalitarian systems. So I think the question surely for me to ask is, will revisionist tendencies be successful in a country like India, right? In Britain, the way it has been successful is by completely not acknowledging the role of colonialism and the colonial footprint that Britain has in a realistic light. It has always been seen as, a beacon civilizing the world, that kind of nonsense. I'd be very interested to see whether RSS's attempt to kind of cast certain people in certain light, and I'm speaking generally about the Gandhi-Nehru axis, Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru, and the fact that there's a shrill cry that Nehru was the architect of separating countries, and the partition was just that guy's ambition. I don't know whether that revisionist thing will succeed. What's your view?
I'm a little less optimistic than you. I think it is already succeeding to some extent.
Right.
And this has happened through really a capture of educational institutions. I was talking to a colleague of mine who knows people who teach in Delhi University and, even some other universities like the private universities. And, one of the things that she mentioned was that she has colleagues at these places and they've very clearly been told, whether it's a private university like Ashoka University, they've apparently, like, the message is that as a faculty member there you can't critique, the BJP or what the BJP is doing. Delhi University positions, academic positions, etc., have really been captured by the kind of right. So that combined with this, massive kind of flow of garbage on social media, it does, have some kind of like impact, definitely. And I think in India at the same time, there's, we are also seeing a kind of cinematic equivalent of historical figures or quasi-historical figures. Or even mythic figures that you've seen. Okay, so there was the whole controversy over Padmavati, who didn't actually exist. But the response to it showed that here was an attempt to bring someone from the realm of myth into history. To me, what's happened with Churchill is exactly the opposite, that what you're doing is you're mythifying a kind of historical figure. And I think we are going to see something like this happening in India also. I'm pretty sure that we'll start seeing films on Savarkar. We might even see a film on Godse, revising his sort of place in history, or which would actually be an apology of sorts for, apologia, not an apology for what he did, but a kind of apologetics, trying to defend, why he was compelled to assassinate Gandhi. We might well see it. This is speculation. And I'm absolutely certain that, when we see stuff like on Bhagat Singh and all, there's already been an attempt to kind of co-opt Bhagat Singh into the Hindu nationalist frame, whereas Bhagat Singh was someone who was a communist. So there are going to be important historical differences, but I think we might see something similar happening in the Indian context.
Well, look, we've talked long about, Churchill, the imagination of that movie and the depiction of that movie and how Churchill is held up and regarded. Both of us agree that he got away by being on the winning side of the war, not being taken to court or held to account for the death of 4 million people in famines in Bengal. Just one example. So we think that he's a criminal. We agree with Mr. Tharoor's assessment that, I think the most succinct assessment that Tharoor put of Churchill was that he's a racist windbag, which is basically a person who's extremely bigoted but is partial to speaking well. Right, he expresses himself very succinctly and well. Now, cut to what is happening in India. The revisionist revisionist tendencies of making people like Godse seem like God sent. Let's see whether that happens or not. I hope the pragmatic response is there will be some group of people who will think that Nathuram Godse was a man who was trying to save and unify the country. But I would like to think that the vast majority of the people in our country will look at somebody like Gandhi and say that it was his project that got us across the line. It was not a perfectly run race, but he was up against people like Churchill. So, he did the best that he could in his time.
And actually, I think, there's a whole other conversation here about Gandhi's brilliance. I think what Gandhi did by, wearing that loincloth, because of which Churchill called him a half-naked fakir, is that was such a brilliant political gesture because he refused to engage with the likes of Churchill on anything to do with Churchill's terms, right? Or the West. He engaged with the West purely on his own terms. So, but again, that is another conversation to be had. Yeah, I would, interestingly enough, actually even support a film that would be made, on Godse, because I think in India what's going to happen is a film like that hypothetically would get opposed because of the hagiographic nature of the way in which we worship Gandhi, right? And I think that Gandhi is a tremendously important figure. I think historical rubbish should not be force-fed to our students, but at the same time, I don't think Gandhi should be above criticism. So what's going to wind up happening probably is that if people are going to oppose a film critical of Gandhi, they will do it for the wrong reasons, which is that it offends sentiments. But that's India for you. So
a mix of views.
Yeah. Okay.
So Rohit, on that note, let's kind of wrap this episode up, and we'll be back with another one soon.
Excellent. Take care, man. Bye.
So take care. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to us. Rohit and Bunty would like to sign off. Please stay tuned. Follow us on India Explained on Twitter. Keep listening. Thank you for all your support.